Tess Ingram is a UNICEF spokesperson who has just visited Gaza, and she joins us live now from New York. Thank you so much for being with us on the program. As I mentioned, you recently came back from Gaza, and we're now hearing Israel calling for Palestinians in Rafah to evacuate, forcefully displacing them once again. What does this mean for the more than 1 million people there?
It's an absolute horror. Of having been there just a couple of weeks ago, I can tell you that walking around, it is incredibly dense. There are so many people now crowded into the streets of Rafah, and most of them are children, Ethna. When we visited families, there were so many kids in Rafah, and I fear that if the fighting moves to Rafah, we don't know what's going to happen to these children. There is no safe place left for them to go in Gaza. Many of them are exhausted after months of fighting, sick, malnourished. So this is a very serious situation, and I think the global community needs to do everything in its power to stop this from happening.
And the humanitarian situation, as you mentioned, it just keeps on getting worse. The World Food Programme says the aid that's currently entering Gaza is simply not enough to prevent famine. They're being left to starve and are exposed to lethal diseases as well. I mean, if they aren't killed from Israel's attacks, chances are they're going to die due to the lack of aid.
Yeah, that's right. UNICEF has been warning for weeks now about that terrible triple threat between conflict, malnutrition and disease. There's no safe water or very little safe water for the recently displaced children in and around Rafah. And the situation is even worse in the north. So without safe water, without enough food, children really are vulnerable to the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing on the ground. And when I was there, I spoke to medical professionals who told me about the rising cases of diseases they're seeing and how concerned they are about children dying now, not just from the bombs and bullets, but from a lack of food and from disease.
What do you think it is that they need the most right now, Tess?
Well, they need a ceasefire, Ethna. It's really simple. We need to stop the fighting, because while this continues, particularly with the threat of it encroaching on Rafah, people's lives are at incredible risk. So we need a ceasefire immediately so that there's some respite from the fighting, but also so that UN agencies like UNICEF can do our job. Because as you mentioned, it's really difficult for us to get aid into and across the Gaza Strip at the moment. But in terms of that aid, I think people are in desperate need of safe access to water, of proper nutrition, and of warm clothes and blankets, because it's really cold in the Gaza Strip at the moment.
Right, and I want to take a moment to talk about the situation at the hospitals, because it's extremely dire, with even medical staff being shot while treating patients. Many of the hospitals that are now partially operational are surrounded by Israeli tanks, making it difficult for people to enter or leave the buildings. What's your analysis of what you've seen at the hospitals there?
The day I left, the day before I left, I was at NASA Hospital, and this was just before, the fighting really surrounded it. And I can tell you that there are so many families there, displaced families, but also families supporting sick children. So hospitals really need to remain protected places where people can seek medical care, and that medical staff and humanitarian aid staff can continue to operate. So we're all very concerned about the situation at the hospitals, and would urge that the fighting leaves the hospitals alone.
And if we do continue at this rate, Tess, what are we going to be dealing with 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks from now?
It's impossible to say. This has been going on for weeks longer I think than we all would have hoped. We've been calling now since the very beginning for an immediate and long-lasting humanitarian ceasefire, and we're still making those calls now 4 months in. So I just cannot fathom, having been there and seen the impact that already exists in Gaza, and how people really are beyond breaking point at the moment. Mothers and children just continually asking when this is going to end. So it needs to end now.
Indeed. A spokesperson for UNICEF, Tess Ingram, thank you so much for being with us here on TRT World.